Well, hello everyone. Today is Friday, February the 5th, and today's reading comes from Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6 is where I'm going to be reading from today as we read about the death of John the Baptist. Matthew talks about this, Mark and Luke also talk about this, but I want to emphasize Mark's reading today. So get your Bible and turn to Mark chapter 6 with me. And I want to begin the story by going back a little bit to something Mark said previously. So the story of the death of John the Baptist really begins in verse 17. But we need to go back a little bit to see how we have come to this point. So if you jump back to chapter 6 and verse 13, the text says, now this is when Jesus took the 12, as we read yesterday, and sent them out to preach and to heal. Verse 13, and they were casting out many demons and were anointing with oil many sick people and healing them. Now, what's the explanation for this? The news of the miracles and the news of the preaching that the 12 are doing is going to reach the ears of King Herod. Verse 14, which is where today's reading begins. When King Herod heard of this, for his name had become well known, and people were saying, John the Baptist has risen from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. Jesus and the 12, they are able to do this. There is some amazing power that's going on. People are evidently seeing this, and the news even gets back to Herod, and people are saying about Jesus, John the Baptist has come back from the dead. Okay, now obviously what that means is John is already dead. But Mark chapter 6, starting at verse 17, tells us the story of how John died. So when we come to Mark 6, understand John is already dead. But Mark 6 gives us this flashback, and it jumps back and tells us how that happened. So while Herod is hearing about the miracles and the healings and what's going on, and people are saying, John the Baptist has come back from the dead, Herod himself even says, how can that be? John has come back from the dead? Continue reading at verse 15. Others were saying that he is Elijah, and others were saying he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard, he kept saying, John, whom I beheaded, has risen. So this is Herod's explanation. It must be John the Baptist has come back from the dead. And now, beginning at verse 17, we kind of have this bracketed text that jumps back and tells us what happened to John. For Herod himself, verse 17, had sent and had John arrested and bound in prison on account of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip, because he had married her. Now, why did John get arrested? Why was Herod upset with John? Verse 18, for John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. You see, Herod was involved in an adulterous marriage. And John was telling him, that is not right. You are not lawfully allowed to have her. And Herod didn't like that. So he put John in prison to shut him up. And so verse 19 says, Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death and could not do so. For Herod was afraid of John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. He put him in prison, but he kept him safe. He was afraid of John. And we'll see more about that in a moment. And when he heard him, so when Herod heard John, he was very perplexed. But he used to enjoy listening to him. Isn't this interesting? There is this weird dynamic between Herod and John. You know, John is preaching, and he's, as you remember from earlier readings, he's kind of this rugged character, and he is just saying things plainly and speaking in a way that is easily understood. And apparently Herod liked that. He liked the fact that John didn't pull any punches and he was a plainly spoken man. But then when John started saying, you're not allowed to have her as your wife, well, Herod didn't like that so much. And yet he still kind of respected John. He also knew that the people respected John. And if he just put John to death, then the people would get upset about that because they believed that John was a prophet, and they were right about that. So Herod kind of has this weird tension, it seems, with John. And Herodias wants to kill him, but she's not able to because Herod's not letting her do it. And there's conflict all around here, it seems. Now, verse 21. A strategic day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his lords and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And when the daughter of Herodias herself came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you. And he swore to her, whatever you ask of me, I will give it to you, even up to half of my kingdom. And she went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? And now Herodias has her chance. Remember, verse 19 said Herodias wanted to put John to death, but she wasn't able to do it. Now she has the opportunity because her daughter was dancing before Herod and before these other leading people. And Herod made this foolish promise. I'll give you whatever you want, even up to half of my kingdom. And so now Herodias knows exactly what she wants to ask for. In verse 24, she said, the head of John the Baptist. And immediately she came in a hurry to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And although the king was very sorry, yet because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests, he was unwilling to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded him to bring back his head. And he went and had him beheaded in the prison, and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about this, they came and took away his body and laid it in a tomb. What an awful story. And there's so much going on in this story. I've already talked about the conflict that exists with Herod and Herodias, and John is caught in the middle of this. And John is stuck here. He's in prison. He is caught between the wishes of Herod and the wishes of Herodias. And Herodias, who is wanting John to be killed, is restrained by Herod, who's not happy with John, but at the same time he's not ready to kill John. He doesn't want to do that. John is just stuck in between here. In between these two people who have their competing desires and wishes as they relate to John. We might look at this story and we might draw a number of points to consider. I think one point that is oftentimes brought up when this story is considered is Herod should have been more thoughtful and careful before he spoke. He makes this foolish vow and oath to the daughter of Herodias. I'll give you whatever you want. Just name it. It's yours. And she asked for something that he didn't anticipate. But as the text said, he was restrained by his oath that he had made to her, the promise that he had made to her, and because all of those officials who were there, they heard what he said. And he couldn't renege on his promise. He had to keep up his end of the bargain. And so he had to keep up those appearances before all of these other officials. And so we can talk about the foolishness of Herod's vow, and we should. That's a lesson that we clearly learn from this. But here's something else to think about. You know, John the Baptist, he was an amazing character. He had a great mission to prepare the way for Jesus, to prepare the hearts of people so that Jesus could come and preach and be received into their hearts. Jesus himself said that of those born among women, there is none greater than John the Baptist. I mean, what high remarks coming from the Lord himself. And yet, this is the way that John leaves this earth. This is the way that John is treated. He is executed by a godless king simply because he spoke foolishly and made this rash promise. That sure seems mighty unfair to John, doesn't it? Wouldn't we have expected something better to happen to John? Why does God let John die like this and at this time? Well, I'm going to tell you, I don't know. I don't know the answers to those questions. Can I offer some things? Sure. Are they right? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. Why does God do anything? Why does God do what God does? And at some point, we have to sit back and say, we don't know the answer. God does what he does, when he does, because God is God. And I may not fully understand that, and that's okay. Kind of previewing a little bit, for those of you who are members of the Taylor's Church, I'm kind of previewing a little bit a topic that's going to be coming up soon in our Bible class on Deuteronomy. So hold this thought in your mind for a few more weeks. But back to this text and back to the story of John. We say, this is unfair. Why should John have to suffer like this? Well, the world isn't a fair place. And frankly, there was somebody else who came along 6 months after John, who is also going to be treated unfairly, who is also going to be killed by godless people who didn't know what they were doing. And so even God himself, in the person of Jesus Christ, experiences an unfair treatment and even death. But maybe God lets this happen at this time because John's mission was fulfilled. His task was to prepare the way for Jesus to come, and he did that. His task was completed. And I'm sure God had other reasons why this episode with John unfolded in the way that it did. Reasons that God may not even give to us. But God has them. And as much as we may not like what happens to John, this is what happened. It's unfortunate. It's unfair. But I don't know what we do about that. Sometimes God's people are treated in ways that are unfortunate and unfair. But John was a godly, righteous servant. And John is where he wanted to be. He is in the presence of God, having fulfilled what God sent him into this world to do. Who cares that he was killed in this way? Do you think John regrets doing what he did and living the way that he lived and preaching what he preached? Of course not. John has gained his reward. And so there's solace in that, isn't there? Well, that's today's reading. Thank you for studying along with me. God bless you. Have a good day.